Okay, algebra, we're talking about graphing a square root function. So the first video, you kind of got visuals using Desmos.com of different square root functions and what they look like and how they kind of move around the coordinate plane. So now we're going to talk about determining the domain of the functions. So to determine the domain, remember, let's remind ourselves what domain is. Domain is all of the x coordinates. So basically we're figuring out what are all of the possible x coordinates that we can plug into these equations. So to do this, it's actually pretty straightforward. What you do is you take what's under the square root symbol and you make it greater than or equal to 0, and then you solve that inequality. So I take x plus 3 and I make it greater than or equal to 0. And now I just solve this inequality. Pretty basic. I just subtract 3 and I get x is greater than or equal to -3. So this is telling me that I can plug in every x coordinate that is greater than or equal to -3. So for example, I plug in -3, -3 plus 3 is 0, I can take the square root of 0. If I plug in 5 plus 3 is 8, I can take the square root of 8. It's going to be a decimal, but I could do it. I can't do anything less than -3 though. If I plug in -4, -4 plus 3, that's -1. You can't take the square root of a negative number. Also, the other nice thing about once you know the domain is, you know the vertex, the starting point of the graph. You know, if you remember, they were the curved part of a parabola. This is where it's going to start. It's going to start at -3. That's the x coordinate it's going to start at. So let's look at our next one here. Y equals 3 times the square root of x minus 7. So same thing. We take what's under the square root, x minus 7, and we make it greater than or equal to 0. That 3 outside the square root doesn't matter. That has no impact on figuring out the domain. So then we just solve this. We add 7 to both sides, and we get x is greater than or equal to 7. So the domain for the second one here is x is greater than or equal to 7. 7 and everything greater will work. Anything less than 7 won't work. If I plug in 6 minus 7 is -1. I can't take the square root of a negative number. Let's look at our next one here. Y equals the square root of 4x. So I'm going to take what's under the square root, 4x, and make it greater than or equal to 0. So to solve this, I just divide by 4, and I get x is greater than or equal to 0. So x can be 0 and everything greater than it. Let's do the next one. I got y equals the square root of -4x under the square root, and then plus 2. Again, I take what's under the square root. That plus 2 does not matter when it comes to finding the domain. So -4x is greater than or equal to 0. So to solve, I divide both sides by -4. And remember, when we divide by a negative, when we're solving inequalities, when you multiply or divide by a negative number, you have to reverse your sign. So this ends up x is less than or equal to 0. And that actually makes sense, because think about it. If you plug in any positive numbers into this, -4 times a positive number is going to be a negative number, and you can't take the square root. But -4 times a negative number, you'll end up getting something that's positive, and then you can take the square root. So this is how you find out the domain of a square root function. All you got to do is take what's under the square root, make it greater than or equal to 0. Another video coming.